We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
G'day, and welcome to the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there's more than just one way to be a man. I'm your host, Brandon Clift, and if this is the first time you're joining us, this is the show where men come to talk about difficult stuff with their masks off, their guards down, and their hearts open. You see, a lot of the topics we've covered thus far have been really challenging stuff. I'm talking topics that are taboo in many households and many cultures. Topics that are being fought hard right now in the streets, in the media. And so here is where we want to bring men, regardless of their background, their religious affiliation, their political affiliation, or how their upbringing. This is a chance where men can get together and look at themselves in the mirror and find out how they can align with their mission in life and the man that they want to be. And so I want to welcome you to come here if this is the first time you've joined us, and you're really in for a treat today, because today we have award-winning filmmaker Ian MacKenzie, who joins us to talk about all things about the mythopoetic journey of man. This is the kind of realm of, consciousness around manhood and masculinity that I'm still very kind of green in. And so it's nice to have someone like Ian come on that is very fluent in a lot of the stuff pertaining to the mythic masculine. Now, you're really going to enjoy this episode if you have been asking yourself the questions like, what does it mean to be a man in the world today in 2021? And you may also be curious about how the men's movement has got to where it is today, right? How the conversations have landed today based on the history and where we've come from. And especially if you have worries or concerns about the kind of world that we're going to be leaving behind for Keith Richards. The kind of world that we're going to be leaving behind for our children and Keith Richards, because that dude never dies. This is a really enjoyable interview with Ian. It's one we recorded last year, so you might hear us reference 2020 as if it's the present day. So that kind of explains that. But I think you're really going to enjoy Ian's take on things. He's got an incredible knowledge base. He's got a fantastic podcast called The Mythic Masculine, which we'll have linked in the show notes. And yeah, without further ado, I want to introduce you to the man himself, Ian MacKenzie. Enjoy.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. I just gave a share to my social, so hopefully we'll draw in some mass crowds. I am primarily a filmmaker, been doing documentaries for about 13 years now, actually. Largely exploring the rise of emergent culture. So whether that is going to Burning Man, I made a number of short films about Burning Man, or following the Occupy movement, when it burst onto the world scene in 2011, or going to Fukushima in Japan after 3/11, which was their partial meltdown. I really went to explore, what are the transformational seeds in these moments, these like liminal moments, and then share those primarily through documentaries. And more recently, even I did a documentary about the rise of the feminine, and that was called Amplify Her. It really looked at women in electronic music and DJs and producers. That was released a couple years ago. And through that journey, actually by exploring the feminine, where I read Marion Woodman and started going into archetypal psychology and all this stuff, it really revealed how little I knew about the masculine. And that launched me alongside finding the book Iron John by Robert Bly, which so many have. That really launched me into this inquiry into the masculine in my own journey, which that was about 5 years ago. And that's culminated now in the latest sort of exploration, which is now a podcast, which I launched last December. And that is looking really at the mythology of the masculine, and that appropriately is titled The Mythic Masculine, which is somewhat of why we're speaking here today.
Fantastic. Well, I tell you what, mate, not many people within their first 13 episodes of a podcast have the the kind of set list and the guests that you've been able to bring on there. Like you got Dr. Martin Shaw, you've got Adam Jackson from the Sacred Sons, you've got Michael Meade. Like, mate, clearly this is what you should be doing in my in my judgment, man, because it's really cool stuff. And so my question for you, mate, is, so you said you came across Iron John, which is a book that we reference a lot in the Mankind Project. Obviously that story about the little boy who has his golden ball and loses it to, it rolls into Iron John's cage. Mate, that book has changed so many lives. And if I'm not mistaken, like, actually tell us how you came across that book. That's probably the best way I'd like to go about it.
Yeah. So I had a friend at the time, we were working on a film, and he himself was also going through, his own inquiry into soul work and the masculine. And so he actually began reading the book and mentioned it again, to me. I'd heard a little bit about it, but he's like, you got to read this book. It's just, it's everything. And so I kind of put it off. And then in 2015, both my grandfathers died within a few months of each other. And when I was going to the apartment of one of my grandfathers, who was a fairly interesting fellow, like he was fairly estranged from our family. Didn't really know him growing up. This is on my mom's side. And yet he was this mysterious figure that, was, I don't know, out pursuing truth, with a capital T. And, after he died, we'd spent very brief times together, and I was grateful for them. But after he died, I went to his apartment with his son, my uncle. We were tending to his things. And I just found, just stacks and reams of books of every subject, mythology, culture, philosophy. He clearly was, again, he had this deep inquiry into, trying to understand the world and everything about it. And on one particular stack was a copy of Iron John, just sitting there, which, was sort of, it's so obviously sort of coincidentally placed in a place where, for me in that moment, it just felt like a literal, message from him directly saying, it's time for you to read this book. And I sort of took the sign as what it was, and began reading the book. And pretty soon after, I was really rocked by how so much of what I was going through as a man, I mean, that age I was around 30, 35. And so much of what I was going through was so clearly articulated in this book that, on the one hand, I felt a bit sort of, a sense of relief that, wow, this is amazing. Like, this has happened before, or people know about this stuff. And then the other hand, I was like, oh, so I'm not the special snowflake that I thought I was, that my story actually is recognizable, and it is for so many men, in particularly in this culture. So it really launched me into a sense of like, wait a second, like, how did I not know about this book beforehand, for one? And then as I pulled that thread and I began to connect with like Michael Meade and Mankind Project and lots of other groups and kind of like ecstatic transmissions that happened in that first wave of what became known as the mythopoetic men's movement. And largely I felt during my research after that time that it had gone underground, because again, like, I hadn't heard about it, none of my friends really had heard about it. And it felt more like in recent years, though, there had been a resurgence of this kind of thing, whether it is like MKP, of which I myself, was invited to, or through a friend, to come and do the weekend, which I did, or more recent groups like Sacred Sons, of which I've spent some time now with them. And it struck me actually when I was also there that there really was this second wave, like the spiral was coming around again. And I felt like it was urgent that these two waves met, that they actually didn't kind of like miss the wisdom that was garnered the first time around, and also that they didn't lose the inspired creativity and imagination that was actually coming through the youngers as well, and that's so much of the intergenerational divide is when they realize, or when they don't realize they need each other. And so, for me, this podcast became an exploration and also a kind of a plea for these groups to like find each other again.
I think it's such an interesting journey you bring up, where we had this, when Joseph Campbell was releasing his writings and his teachings after he'd been traveling the world and staying and living with these tribal cultures, and the things he was coming up with, just thousands of years of these myths and these legends and these stories that related so much to the human experience of what we go through as special snowflakes in the 50s and the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? And then, it almost seems like the yuppie era of the 80s, it was like a pimple. Like it was just had to come out because that was the time of excess. And then we had people like Bill Kauth, Rich Tosi, that's when the Mankind Project was popping up and other organizations were starting to show. But there was that kind of time where it just kind of whoop, went back down again. And what makes you think that there's this emergence right now of, because I mean, everywhere I look on social media, I'm just seeing like all these socially conscious warriors just swinging their swords. And I'm like, what a time to live that we're having these conversations now. It seems to be left and right. So tell us a little bit why you think why it's emerging again.
Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate to what I would call or what has been called, and I also would hold as a sort of nuance, is this connection to the mythopoetic men's movement. Because I would say that, certainly men's work and personal growth and all the rest, has also, come through a resurgence. And so there is a particular thread, though, which I feel like I'm most compelled by. Because I do feel like, a lot of men's work also is happening today, and they've really like demythologized it.
Right.
And okay, fine, if that's what serves for those particular groups. But I actually feel like the mythology really is the thing that is the kind of, richness that binds, the men of today and the story of masculinity, to previous wonderings about what does it mean, to be a man. What does the masculine mean? And it changes in every era. Yeah. Right. That's the whole important thing, that it is a question that continually, reveals itself. And so for me, looking back at the previous wave, I've wondered too about what went underground or why it went underground. Speaking with Meade, who was, I went to his island on Vashon. We'd met a little bit prior to that. And I even said to him, hey, would you ever talk about early days of the men's movement? And he was like, yeah, okay. And then a couple years later, I tracked him down again. I was like, okay, can we? For real? And he was very generous, and the podcast is available for people who want to listen. And, what he said was that, those early days were really about trying to find and express the wild man, right? Archetype, which again, for a lot of men, we're also feeling that sense of being chained to, life as it is in maybe the office or whatever, and didn't have access to that more, wildness. But the problem that he named as well was that, because the feminist wave had, maybe second wave by then, had come through and burned the bras and had really been a movement, right, by that stage. And in many ways, they were demanding that the men do the work too, right? Which is sort of, it's actually interesting to track how the mythopoetic really was a response, like a cultural response to that moment. Of a couple offshoots came too, like men's rights movement as well started around that, I believe, that time. And it's very important, I think, not to actually confuse those. Because, the men's rights movement today even gets a lot of criticism as a kind of, excusing of the violence from men and all these kind of things. But the mythopoetic, to me, again, it's important to see them as sort of offshoots, as cultural response to that first wave. And then what happened was, I think this, like with Bly and others, they were really trying to wonder about how to be fathers, actually. That's also what happened. They had kids and they're like, what do I have to offer them, or what can I offer them? And there's a sense of like, hey, we got to get together, And Meade, he says those early days, they called it a movement, but that was more of a media kind of a framing of it. And he was very suspicious of that. He's like, no, let's don't call it a movement. He's like, men get together in a movement and you get armies, you get war. Yep. We don't need a movement. Men need soul work. Yeah. And yet at the same time, there was this kind of big expectation almost of this brand, of it's the men's movement coming out. And so I think it largely spiraled in on itself after that, because also, with sort of personal growth and development work, it's almost like it just kind of circles the never endingness of, you could always be better. Yeah. And that's like the kind of personal growth sort of mantra of the day. It's like, just get better for the sake of it. But again, you can sell a lot of products that way, but, it doesn't really lead anywhere. And so I think what's happened now is, as men have also now, no surprise, with Me Too, being another cultural moment where women are basically saying, that's it, no more. Yeah. Men, I think, are scrambling to be like, whoa, so what does this actually ask of us now? Yeah. Right? What is this actually asking of us? And, thankfully, Mankind Project has been around, many years now. And and I do believe is also maybe deepen this inquiry about, again, what does it mean today? Like, what did it mean then when it started? What was the kind of most creative and life-serving response? Was it to get guys together on the weekend and do, be wild men, right? But today, I feel like it's something else. Something else is being asked. And these other groups like Sacred Sons and many other groups, Everyman and things, they're in this question. And lastly, maybe to say that I do believe the fundamental kind of, binding orbit for the current day needs to be a deep relationship to the world, to life, rather than, spiraling around the orbit of the self, which that's what happened, I think, last time. And that's the thing that we need to learn this time.
Well, there's a multitude of things that I would like to, that I would love to go deeper on with you around that. But I'd say what's probably the most alive in me right now is I remember when the Me Too movement came out, and I was probably only a year or two into the work. And I remember that it took many by surprise, many not by surprise whatsoever, but it did take many men by surprise to where, I was sitting in circle with men that were like, cool, yeah, I need to feel, just give me the shame, pack on the shame. Like, yep, I'm a man, I can take it, bring it on. And that's I think where there seems to be like, there's a power to a movement and the beauty to a movement, but then it so easily gets polarized right there. We have good guys, we have bad guys. And I saw so many men, and I did this myself, we're like, yes, we men have been a part of a patriarchal movement, and so we are the bad guys. And we need to step down and step back. And I remember speaking to one of my mentors, who's one of the founders of MKP in Australia, and he was like, it's time for us to equalize. Now it's time for us to let's equalize here, and let's really start to work together on this stuff. But for a lot of men, and for many, like, you think about how long this work has been around. Some would say, well, 30, 40 years since its first emergence. And that's not a lot of time. But then again, it's really starting to move. And so it's a tricky journey to take those first steps. It can be scary because some men are so terrified of shame. I'm one of them. So what would you say, what would you say is because there's many organizations out there, of course, and I will get to my question. There's so many organizations out there that use big words that common man have never heard of, aren't familiar with. How do you see a bridge? Like, if it was up to you, how would you see a bridge that could be built to make that journey as, I don't want to say smooth, but as accessible as possible to as many men as possible? Because that's something I've been trying to figure out through all this.
Yeah, this is a big question. And I could take a circuitous route around it, because I think it needs to be approached in the right way. And first to say, we are in a very particular moment where, I recently had an indigenous fellow on my podcast, Dallas Goldtooth, who's he's a comedian and also an incredible activist. And I asked him, I'm like, how come there's not more indigenous people? It seems to be indigenous men in this kind of men's work. And he's like, well, to be honest, like probably because all of the kind of settler colonialism is probably right there, rampantly, there, but not as recognizable to those who aren't of the class that would recognize it immediately. But also he's saying because likely there's a lot of work that needs to be done within the particular peoples. Right. So kind of like blending isn't necessarily the right move just for the sake of saying, oh yeah, we're diverse. We got lots of different people. So that's the sort of first part of this question to me is, because if I think about what is modern society or what most modern countries, right? If I'm in Canada, the US, you said you're living in the US now as well, that, we're basically, so many don't have ancestrally kind of alive cultures anymore, right? Where this question, right? How do we make this accessible to all men? Like that would just be a bizarre question if we were all living within, our own like intact ancestral peoples, because we would only be concerned with our own peoples, right? Just like everybody would be. And it's not a problem. That's actually the beauty of diversity, right? We'd be like, well, this is how we do it. This is like indigenous people. It's like nobody says all indigenous people do this, right? They're always like, well, this is how we do it, but other people do things differently. So my answer to your question is like, we're kind of in this weird conundrum, right? Which is we're trying to, and essentially monocrop men's work in order to hit the most amount of people as possible, quote, to create the most transformation. But you can see the inherent challenge of that is that all of a sudden, if people don't fit the mold or whatever it is, it's like you inherently kind of come up against, well, how do we enforce almost like a monopoly or a monocrop of men's work, right?
Which creates its own problems.
Yeah, exactly. So we're kind of in an interesting moment. And, the way I wonder about this question too, though, is that, there's something to be said, though, for those that are willing to actually engage and at what level. So some are willing to do the readings. They're going to read the stories. They're going to be ecstatic about finding Bly and doing the Mankind weekend. But others are going to be like, whoa, this is weird. Sitting in circle is like weird, like that's a common thing for a lot of men who aren't used to intimacy or spaces to being vulnerable, right? And at the same time, I still believe the most potent way of transformation, at least at that first stage, is when you as the messenger can be the message. Right? When maybe it isn't, hey, come to the circle, come to the men's group each week, right? But maybe it's your way of engaging with the man where you actually treat him as a brother, as solidarity, in solidarity. Maybe you don't other him, right? Maybe you actually, hey man, you seem like you're upset, whatever, in just the day to day, you know what I mean? Like there's a way of, kind of subverting the kind of suspicion that so many men have for each other, as these kind of, might break out into violence at any moment or whatever it is, like there's just these core level frequencies of distrust, I think, that a lot of men carry. Even on the surface, if it's, let's crack a beer and hang out, like, sure, but there's something below often that to really get, deeper, there's a real layer there. So there's a way of, kind of being that frequency, I think, that is actually really helpful. I mean, that, again, that's one other way to think of it.
There's a cliche here, I think, that many would like to avoid, but to be the change we want to see in the world, right? To just operate on that level.
Yeah, and it's always, because I'm going to hear that, and there's others. Not that you mentioned it, but I think of other ones that are trotted out a lot, like Buckminster Fuller's quote: "You can never win by fighting the existing system. You always have to build, make the existing model obsolete." And for me, these kinds of things they're more like yes and. Right, yeah, which is like yes, and I think that so much of the insanity of what we understand to be men's behavior, in this culture, is part of the consequence and the conditioning and the trauma that comes from the current modern industrial civilization. Yeah, right. And so this idea that men can kind of do their work in a vacuum, right, and sort of like either go off or even personal grow themselves as much as they want, which is good, and it's helpful often to for men to come to almost like a baseline self-awareness and emotional literacy and all these things that are really valuable. But I think beyond that, we have to really look at, okay, how do we actually confront systemic power and modern industrial civilization, which itself is built upon all these insane principles of personal growth and domination and all the rest. So this is what I mean by, at a certain point, that men's work has to interface more broadly with like the wider context, which is where the kind of dynamic change begins to happen.
Do you think one of the ways where we could actually start to see impacts and changes on the surface level, I'm talking like the people that are on our television screens that we see on Facebook all the time, do you think in a way one thing that could really help with this move are like someone to champion it, right? Someone to really be the model. Yeah. So that people can go, that guy to me is the definition of success. She has the characteristics of someone I would say is successful. But then it's like, okay, well, let's work backwards. How have they gotten there? Is it through this industrious approach, or is it through actually a counterintuitive approach to actually starting with the self and then letting that kind of like bleed out to everything else?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess I hear a little bit in your question, some of the paradox that we noticed a lot with Occupy Love, which is a film I did with director Velko Ripper. We tracked the Occupy movement for the first year. This is back in 2011. And the title even, Occupy Love, was really trying to crystallize what felt like an understanding that came out in that moment, which is this tension between spirituality and activism, right? This idea that For a long time, spiritualists would be, you got to meditate, otherwise you're just going to recreate the system, as it is. So get on that cushion, and then the activists would say, meditation, forget it. Like, we got to be in the streets and actually stop the machine, right? So that tension, I feel, was actually kind of resolved in Occupy, when it was like, look, we need both.
Yeah.
Occupy, love, right? And so I see the same with this idea of, is it modeling, or, is it doing self-work, or is it the system? And of course, only attacking the system or engaging with the system means that, yeah, you're going to be doing lots of things that are still in the shadow for you. But also only focusing on the self is that you're going to always find reasons to, overprocess. If you're not, okay, what's useful to engage with the challenges of the day?
If you're enjoying the Mankind podcast, how about taking another step? Now, this one takes some courage. And you have it. Come check out the Men's Work Introduction. It's 3 sessions over 3 weeks. New sessions start every month, where you can join other men on the path. Go to bit.ly/menswork1.
Does it cross your mind often about the world that our kids are going to inherit? Like, I know you're a father.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask this way. As things currently stand, with the trajectory that we're on right now that looks like this, and for those listening, my hand's going in all these different directions.
Mm-hmm.
For the path that we're on right now, would you be confident that our kids are going to be inheriting something, I want to say different, but let's just say objectively better, or subjectively better than what I guess we've been raised in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a big question. Just for the listeners, my son, he's 19 months now. So, he's definitely bright-eyed and wondering and climbing everything. And it's certainly a question, that's come to me. And, I think it's important to be able to take a step back as well from what feels like the urgent mania of the moment, and actually be able to recognize that this trajectory that we've been on for a long time. Right? If you want to call it modern industrial civilization, give or take, depending if you're going into more esoteric realms, is perhaps, 10,000 years since we've been domesticating animals and growing crops and all the rest, and essentially spilling over our human limitations that actually, in a way, protected the rest of life from too many humans in too few places, like the consequence of too many humans on a place. And once we started to settle down and we said, hey, this is pretty good. We can grow our own stuff and we can differentiate classes and roles. And now we got, armies and priestly classes, and, our city's getting pretty big now. We got to spill over and take over the other guy's stuff. As soon as we started doing that, this moment was built right into that, right in the very beginning. Right. And so this is an existential point right now in a much larger unfolding, which I do think there is no guarantee. Like, other spiritualists might say, oh yeah, this means everything's perfect, the way it is. But like any rite of passage, which is what this could be understood as, speaking with Martin Shaw in particular, or Charles Eisenstein, in my podcast, we covered this, where, could this be a rite of passage for the human species as a whole? And if so, a true rite of passage means that there is the possibility of failure. Otherwise, it's just a script. Otherwise, it's just, going through the motions. And so I do think that this is the moment we're in. And so I think it's important to wonder about that, right? So what does that ask? And Martin, he says, this is an initiation where the human is not at the center, actually. And therefore, we don't know actually what this is an initiation into. Right. And so the question for me becomes, how do we participate in something like this, of which we don't know what it, quote, means in a sense, but how do we get the skills to navigate? And so what does that mean even for like my son? If it's a question about, will the world be as it is, when he gets old enough to, get a job, or quote, what jobs even be, in 10 years or 15 years, what's our relationship to property and money and all these things? I mean, I would hope that it's different, honestly, because the way that it's been going has been, building over time, and the accumulation of wealth and the consequence of the biosphere and all this stuff. So, let's hope normal is not coming back, actually, right? But it depends on what kind of normal, right? Yeah. And so for me, in this liminal moment, the question is more about, so how do we navigate a moment of almost like of deep possibility, right? Where, even like 3.5 months ago, nobody thought that almost all air travel would ground almost immediately, right? Or the economy would grind to a halt, and the biosphere get a moment to breathe, right?
Yeah.
Like, who would have thought that would happen? That's not to say that all of a sudden everything's great, but who would have thought that was possible? And yet we chose to, because we wanted to limit, exposure and all this stuff. What else could humans choose to do? We have that power.
And that's what I'm really interested to see what happens. I believe that how we navigate as a species, how we navigate the reopening of the economy and actually being in each other's physical presence again, I have a feeling will determine the next phase of this planet.
Mm-hmm.
Like what it's going to look like, because people are going to remember the day that they saw dolphins swimming through the canals of Venice.
Mm-hmm.
People are going to remember the days when they looked outside their window and didn't see a green sky for once.
Yeah.
And so I think it begs the question, like, okay, well, how important is it for me to have all those things that I thought were necessities, which I now know weren't?
Mm-hmm.
How much is it worth sacrificing those moments of beauty where, dolphins swimming in the canals? Like, is it worth sacrificing this opportunity for healing on the planet?
Mm-hmm.
For going back to normal, which I honestly, from majority of the conversations I've been having left and right of the spectrum, a lot of people are very excited to do things differently now.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's what this moment is really granted, right? Like the possibility of real imagination. And just linking it to my previous inquiry into the feminine, right? I spoke about Amplify Her in this film about the rise of the feminine. And this question that a lot of people have been carrying as well, like, what does that mean, right? What does the rise of the feminine mean, or the future is female, and all these kind of things? I think the kind of positive understanding of what that might mean is something I learned. I've also been making a film about a community in Portugal. They're called Tamera. They're like a research community. I've been in there for about 40 years now. They started kind of in the late 70s as a kind of free love hippie experiment, like so many, but with a deep political insight about how deep a revolution would need to go to actually build something different. Wow. And they managed to actually navigate through, the eye of the needle and come through, and are actually now like a thriving 200-person community with some of the edgiest research that has ever been made public. And I've been making a film about the community with 2 other directors over the last 5 years. But one of the things that I learned there was they spoke about this idea that in terms of this dance between the masculine and feminine, that the feminine is where orientation comes from. And you could say the masculine is where the action comes from. And then again, we're not talking about men and women. We're talking about this idea of orientation and like the doing, right? So if you think mythically in this moment, I would say modern culture by and large has a kind of manic, just go for it, masculine shadow happening right now, right? Which is like build, grow, rape, build, pillage, go, like constantly. Do. And the feminine's going like, whoa. Like, why are you doing this though? Like, why? And so I think that part of this kind of archetypal moment is, can we actually come back to that place of listening? And largely, carried, that intelligence is carried largely by the intuitive, by the feminine, which is saying, what is actually worth doing now? Like, what actually serves life? Not what is, great because we can do it. Let's go to Mars because we can do it. Like does that really serve what's actually needed right now? Do we need more weapons? Do we need more stuff? The latest model of whatever? Like, is that really what we need? Right. And so without this kind of arresting that insanity for keep going at all costs, right? Which to me is actually what I would call the, if you think about the 2 archetypal directions of the masculine and feminine, the masculine could be seen as transcendent, right? Which is up and out to Mars, up and out of the body, pure consciousness, observing, the wildness of Shakti, the feminine, all that stuff. So there's different ways of thinking about it. But that same impulse is basically saying Earth, the shadow of it says, the body's not your home. Earth is not your home. Death is the ultimate terror to to one that is caught deeply in the transcendent impulse, right, which wants to live forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's no surprise that the consequence to the rest of life, right, is that energy, that mania, will sacrifice everything else for it to keep going. Whereas the feminine is much more about immanence, right? It's about embodiment. It's about like here. It's about mother. It's about earth, and coming back down to the ground and realizing that, without that, there is no transcendence. Like, where are you going to go? There's a beautiful film you might have seen called it's Hugh Jackman's in it. It's Tree of Life. Yeah, where, highly recommend it. That's basically what the film's about. I won't spoil it, but the trajectory basically of like, where are you trying to get to? And, do you know how lonely you'll be if you leave all of life behind?
Yeah.
So quote, you can get up and out and live forever. That's really where it's headed. So, again, as soon as we begin to be able to see mythically and archetypally, then we can start to see, oh, like this is what's going on. And we can begin to, kind of enact new myths that bring us back down to this moment that actually serves life.
Yeah. It's almost like coming home in a sense. It's like the masculine goes out and hunts and explores and finds new lands, but then brings it back to the hearth, brings it to the fire, brings it to the tribe, and then it's nurtured.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I like this idea of the myth because, naturally a part of me goes, well, give me a 10-point plan for how to be masculine. Like, come on, just tell me what I need to do. Do I need to like wake up every morning and do 200 push-ups and like have cold showers, or is it actually the reverse? And so for many men that, let's just say, that have been born anywhere between 1940 to 1990, it's not going to seem natural to want to start by coming home, by going inwards, by growing down versus growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like that's where the myth can really come in, because the story of Iron John, I've seen the most resistant, hesitant, fearful men actually hear that story and just something snaps. It's just this blinding flash of the obvious where they go, oh my goodness, like the key to my wild man is under my mother's pillow.
Oh yeah, that's an archetypal encounter, to say the least. Yeah, we could go there. I do want to touch on one point though. You said just about how you caught me with the mother's pillow. Now I lost the thread. So maybe we'll circle back to it.
Yeah, no, not to worry. Well, yeah, I think the thing that I'm really excited about right now is the conversations that are being had. That we're starting to bring this to the surface, and it's catching a lot of people by surprise. Almost like I've spoken to friends that know I'm a part of this work, and they haven't seemed to have any interest in it, because when I tell them about it, they're just, okay, sure, that sounds cool. Like, I hope you like it. But now I think we're starting to see, like, as the different poles of the feminine and the masculine are really starting to like get their voice and starting to be heard. And we're starting to see examples of that on social media and in these places that we get to watch, that the road is being paved. And so I want to ask you, Ian, do you feel like there's what do you feel, if you could put it down to like, what would you feel like your role is in this phase that you could say we're in right now? Because I believe you set a great example, like you set a great example as a good role model. Now, I may not have, filmmaking skills or abilities, or may not have the ability to tell a story, but I know there's a role I can play. I know there's a role that anyone can play. And so what is like this current path that you're on right now? What does it mean to you in the greater sphere of things?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. There's something that again came out during the Occupy days, was people had this question, right? Like, well, what do I do? Like, the people that were genuinely wanting to, hear the call, right? And respond to the times. And largely then it was predicated by the 2008 financial collapse and the fact that nobody went to jail, that people were really fed up, right? With what, things that got to change. And so there's this kind of like energy that came through where people generally wanted to know, like, what do I do? What can I do to actually, kind of change things? And the challenge with that is it becomes immediately prescriptive, right? Like, here's the 10 things to do. And I remember at the end of Inconvenient Truth, the film, with Al Gore, that by the end of it, maybe like most, I'm sitting there just wrecked utterly by what I saw. And then the credits had a kind of, so therefore, here's what you do: change a light bulb. And like they kind of had this like things to do, which I felt was probably trying to answer the same thing of like, oh, we can't just leave people here. We got to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
And
void.
Yeah. And the problem is that it just immediately kind of withers with the scope of what's actually needed. Right. Because all of a sudden, you can try those things, but then when you don't see anything really changing largely, then it becomes more disillusioning. Right. And you're like, well, I changed my light bulbs, but we're still, going to hell. So what do we do now? And so I think that there's something more powerful to really be able to come to that place of sitting with that deep intuitive voice. This is like what I spoke to of the feminine. And I think for many men, perhaps what that could mean is, again, what does it mean to come home to that deeper place of listening and, observing, of embodiment, of, wondering like, okay, yeah, what is mine to do actually? Because I really feel that that's actually connected to life's intelligence, right? Because we are life, like our bodies are like extensions of life. And so we, in a way, resonate with information that life is actually constantly radiating to us, right? And if we are able to tune in to the place where we can listen, right, and say, well, wait a second, what's mine to do? Just because I've gone to this job every day, right? Or just because, this is what I usually do, like, is this actually what life is asking of me? Is this what I really want to do? And again, I'm cautioning from this idea of like that every moment's supposed to be passionful. My first film, actually documentary, was a film called 1 Week Job, which my friend worked one job a week for a year. And he really wanted to find, what do I want to do with my life? And so he just said, hey, anybody, if you want to have me, I'll come and work for free. And I just want to know about your job. And he got offers all over the world. Actually ended up working every week for a year. But one of the messages that we learned during that time was almost like, yes, passion's good, but at the same time, often, you don't want to always go after your passion sort of at the expense of everything else, because, life also has a certain degree of challenges and kind of tempering that is really necessary, actually. And if your marker for what's worth doing is constant bliss and passion, then it's like Bly says, and I think in John, about this idea of the flying boy.
Yeah.
Like they're constantly, Peter Pan, you got to like keep pulling them back down to earth. And they're probably lost going to the next festival or Burning Man or whatever, right? So I guess going back to that point that, I'm always with this question: what is mine to do? What is mine to do? And that podcast, The Mythic Masculine, was really that response too. I was just like, I don't know. I feel like it's stirring. It's stirring to me to think about this, and maybe this is mine to do. And then I just sort of tentatively walk down those steps, and then energy comes, right? This is the other thing about, I think, all true law of the universe, the true law of Eros, is that if you are aligned with life, life will respond. Like as the natural current that would support you if you're in that flow. And so I think that, there's an inertia a lot of men have to swim through about momentum of their lives, right? Which is normal to that, what do my friends think? Or, all this stuff, there's momentum. Yeah. But I think stuff like the New Warrior training can be so important to actually crack, right, the pattern of normalcy. Yeah. And so my question too is like, well, what is then kind of invited in, once the pattern has been interrupted, which is really what a rite of passage is meant to do, culturally speaking. Maybe I'll stop there. I said a lot.
Excuse me while I gather my thoughts and all the different areas I could speak to you for hours, but unfortunately we don't have quite that much time. So before we do wrap up, the one thing I want to just kind of create a platform for is, man, what can we expect going forward from you? Like, I'm really excited to see like what you've created. I mean, I'm careful to say in a short period of time. I mean that when I talk about your podcast, right? Because obviously those relationships you've nurtured for a long time. So, man, what can we expect from you going forward? Yeah,
thanks. Definitely, I have a few threads that I'm really intrigued by to keep following with the podcast. Again, there seems to constellate upon a few themes, like rite of passage is some of that, but also this connection to myth and earth. Martin Shaw has this phrase, use myth ecology, which was a really beautiful fusion of what felt like, again, this binding of kind of, myth and soul work to life. And you can hear my son bopping around now in the background. So that's definitely a few lines that I want to track. Also, I think, with this question too around, what does it really take to, I don't know, plant the seeds of, I'll just loosely say, village. And again, I don't mean a particular, like a place, although that is, important to be bound to a place. But I actually see village as a verb. Like village is a thing in motion, is a willingness of people to be together for a particular purpose, of which it is not them. Actually, this is a real deep sort of revelation that I also studied with a teacher named Stephen Jenkinson, who some may know largely of his time in the death trade and palliative care. But he largely now sort of spiraled out and really looked at culture. He's like, where does death phobia really come from, actually? Because he sees it as a symptom of the lack of culture, of true culture. And so what he says about village is that, to leap to the utopian dream that so many do have, right? Of this idea, yeah, we'll just get land and we'll just do the thing. And maybe even, things like MKP I really see what they're doing as sort of a cultural redemption in a way, trying to like kickstart those ancestral memories of what would have been held within a cultural framework by a very particular people. But that this idea that, to leap to that achieved, flower of or garden, permaculture garden maybe, is like, it can't be done because there's a lot of kind of like fumbling that needs to happen to get there. And so what he says, this is Stephen again, that, the thing that we can do for our children is to basically be willing to get it wrong, but be willing to get it wrong with them present and seeing it, because they then grow up in the presence of their parents getting it wrong. Right. But that means they're further along than those of us who, didn't grow up with anything like that. Right. But that gives them a shot to get it right.
And Lying with the Heavenly Woman, Robert John Lee. It says, one of the biggest mistakes that we make as young people is deifying our parents. Oh, they never make mistakes. They're perfect. And so we put them on this pedestal. And as we become adults, it's like, oh, they're not perfect. Then like, boom, my framework for safety, security, stability, and structure is gone.
Yeah.
It's like, now I got to figure it out.
I would love to say something about this. If we
Go for it.
Yeah. Because this is so interesting, because what you just said is a consequence of no village. Mm-hmm. Right? Because if you grow up with parents that have a lot of other trusted adults around you, right? One, they're going to call your parents on their craziness because that's what trusted adults do. And they're also going to model for you other ways of being uncles, and aunties that in a way let your parents off the hook from being deified, as the center of everything. Mm-hmm. And the third thing is that if your parents are willing to be in a way transparently imperfect, what with you, but with the other adults. Now something happens, right? You actually grow a certain degree, I believe, of deep respect that they are human, and you never hold them up as perfect. Now this is a very particular nuance though, which is a lot of what happens without the trusted adults around is that adults can put their vulnerability or their transparency and their emotional baggage on their kids to carry it, but it's not theirs to carry. Mm-hmm. This is a huge distinction. They can be in the presence of it. They can witness it, right? But it is not your kids to carry. And in a culture which, doesn't have the kind of support structures needed for parenting, that happens actually much more than it should. Yeah. So I just wanted to stretch that out a little bit and offer that.
That's fantastic. Because, man, we're going to have to bring you back on just to talk about ancestral wounds.
Well, we could get going.
We could get going. Oh, mate, that's brilliant. And I think it's like you see the child that gets passed around a lot, that gets passed around between so many different hands. It helps create almost a horizontal plane for growth and a vertical. Because I mean, they say the problem with the monkeys in the top of the tree is all you're staring at our asses, right?
I haven't heard that. Is that from Australia?
Well, monkeys probably not, but we have all sorts of euphemisms and things like that. Anywho, nice. But yeah, I like that. It kind of equalizes it and brings it down to a human level. Funny story I'll just share from my end is my sister calls me and she's laughing and I'm like, what's going on? She goes, Hudson, her son, just sent me to the naughty corner. And I was like, did you deserve it? She's like, yep. So she went to the naughty corner. And,
There
you know, what a great example. I thought that was fantastic. So, Ian, mate, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, tell us, how can we follow your journey? How can we support you? And we'll make sure, of course, to pop the links in the description. So take it away.
For listeners that want to connect with my podcast, it's themythicmasculine.com. And there's links to all the other episodes on there, as well as my extensive film work over the last 13 years or so. Almost all of it is available on my website, which is ianmac.com, ianmack.com. And you'll find lots to read and to watch there.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure those links are in there for people to follow up on your journey. Ian, mate, thank you so much for being here, mate, and for joining us for this deeply insightful conversation. I feel like I need to go sit in front of my journal and just stare at it for an hour and see what comes out.
Listen to the feminine. Boom.
Yep, there you go. Coming home. This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. I have been your host, Brandon Clift, and I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. Special thanks, of course, goes to my incredible team, Marketing and Communications Director Boyson Hodgson, producer and editor of this episode, Michael Russo, who makes me sound so much more intelligent than I actually am, so of course, special kudos goes there. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim, Donovan, and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.